So here's the thing for me as a meditation teacher. Until you get to a certain degree of intensity and focus with the breath, it's kind of boring. It's not all that interesting, and it may not even be all that pleasurable, especially if someone is still working on relaxing physical and emotional knots. And that's problematic because if something is not interesting, it is hard to get really absorbed in it. But I think the beauty of sound and the beauty of music makes it easier to enter into absorption and to come to a unitive meshing of attention and object, which we call samadhi. To go to that place is easier when something is beautiful. And I was given as my first practice, listening practice, and that was helpful for me because when I tried to focus on the breath, I just encountered all of my knots. And I just encountered like how grasping had it embedded itself in my body. But then doing listening practice for hours and hours, it was like in that space, this could work itself out. These knots could undo themselves in that space rather than directly facing them. Well, for one thing, we have the very famous koan, "Bring me the sound of a single hand." And while that's not primarily about listening practice, it's also not about listening. And one can, enter absorption into the koan through listening. There's also the famous koan that comes pretty early in training of "Stop the sound of the distant temple bell." And I think there's an appreciation in the Zen tradition. If you think of temples being on mountaintops traditionally, or even Asian temples are permeable because they would have rice paper screens, or they would need to, before air conditioning, need to have airflow. One's practice would not be in some kind of vacuum of soundlessness, but the world's sounds would be all permeating and penetrating. And because Zen practice is about non-separation, working with the senses is kind of a natural thing, and not going into some kind of meditation cocoon. That's not our flavor. So on the other hand, how many traditions and lineages have actually focused on listening practice extensively? I don't know. It's not one of the two main practices of Japanese Zen. You find some Japanese teachers talking about it. I believe Basui, you can read the record of Basui, and Basui would talk about, do you hear the dog barking in the distance? And the students would say yes. And then Basui would say, well, that's your Buddha mind. Without any effort, without need for you to discriminate whether it's a horse or a bird, you intimately, immediately, effortlessly know it's a dog barking. And sometimes in the past, I or other leaders have played deliberately challenging music. And the intent of that, when we're working with more kind of wrathful, intense vibrations, is to help us, to invite us into the non-discriminating mind. And the Tibetans call it one taste, and we might call it no mind in Zen. That is, we can all drop to a place where it's just vibration. It's deeper than our opinions. It's even deeper than how we feel about what we're experiencing. We're just at the level of energy. And it's hard to get there unless you're faced with the challenge, unless you're up against the mind that says, oh, this is irritating. I don't like this. Why are they playing? This is terrible. And the teacher can reflect, if you're in that state of mind, you're not in your deeper, there's a deeper place that you could be resting. And also in this retreat, we work with, okay, you're listening with this degree of attentiveness, of closeness, we could call it. Who's listening? What is it that hears the sound? And we bring in the insight practice to keep it sharp and to have it actually be liberative, i.e., cutting into the sense of duality. So if someone is watching this or listening and they're concerned that, well, I want to do a serious meditation retreat. If I'm going to take 9 days, I want to do the real thing. And my feeling is this is definitely the real thing. It's a funny idea that we believe that deep and real practice has to be hard, rough, austere, etc. I think that's a fixed belief. You remind me of another dimension of the practice, and that is dispelling the duality, the notion that there's such a thing as no sound. We touch both sides, actually. We see that sound is a kind of dream that you can't ever grasp, but also silence is an idea. If you're alert, there's always a fullness of vibration. And so at different times in this session, we work with the sound of silence and just inviting us to get more attentive. And it's almost as if there's this bandwidth of sound always going on, of vibration, and we have lost our sensitivity to what's not like acute or popping out colorfully. But as we settle in Sesshin, the voice of silence becomes more evident, and working with that is also quite delicious.